Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at UC San Diego. My name is Steve Clary. I'm the chair of the curriculum committee and the host for this morning lecture, which features one of our own colleagues, another distinguished member of the medical profession. Very pleased to have Joel with us. He spoke a few years ago, sort of this continuing adventure, which he's been at now for 40 years, studying the Nazi war criminals. Many of you are familiar with his book, Anatomy of Malice, which looks at 4 of the Nazi war criminals, including the labor minister Robert Ley, who is the subject of this morning's discussion. I won't dwell on the subject since Joel's going to cover that. He is a very busy man in retirement, written over 400 publications, including a number of books. As he says, it's more a matter of perspiration than inspiration. But we're very pleased to have him.
It's a pleasure to be back here. This group has actually been very helpful in shaping my own thinking and the work that resulted in the book. I've presented here before talking about the overall project of the psychiatrists and the psychologists at Nuremberg. And then I spoke again talking about Rudolf Hess and his puzzling psychiatric presentations. Today I'd like to talk about a different war criminal that raises some very different issues. One occasionally reads about a bad brain. There are 2 distinct connotations here. One is that criminal actions follow in the wake of a brain defect, and the other is that the individual is morally flawed. Increasingly, both of these statements are finding their way into the courtroom in what is called neuro law. Does malice lurk in the brain? What if you had a war criminal's brain? What would you look for? I'd like to talk with you about Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, architect of strength through joy, developer of the Volkswagen, crusader for workers' rights, virulently anti-Semitic, propagandist, destroyed the labor unions in Nazi Germany. A melange of very different behaviors. His history is also interesting because he was a severe alcoholic who had survived repeated massive head injuries. Some have felt that these head injuries contributed to his actions and should be considered in judging his behavior. So please consider me your resource person for the morning. I'll present his history as obtained from interviews, diaries, interrogations, psychological testing, and his autopsy. Some of us in the audience are physicians, psychologists, attorneys. All of us are citizens. So I ask you, please rely on your training, your life experience. Consider if you were on a jury, or consider if you were involved in the court case. How would you judge the extent of Robert Ley's responsibility? Today, most people are unfamiliar with Robert Ley. I'm just curious, how many of you in the audience ever heard of him? Very few people have heard of him before. He was one of the highest-ranking Nazi leaders to face trial at the original International Military Tribunal. He was born in 1890. He came from a poor German farming background and was raised on a farm as one of 11 children. His father developed massive financial problems and resorted to arson. Ley was 6 years old at the time, and when his father was arrested and subsequently imprisoned, that humiliation haunted Ley for the rest of his life. He was very sensitive to poverty and disgrace. He was very involved in trying to address problems of the working man, and he was also very involved to make sure that he never faced poverty again. He enlisted in the Army in World War I and was an aircraft spotter, an artillery spotter, when his plane was shot down over France. The plane crash resulted in the death of the pilot, but Robert Ley survived, having suffered many fractures and a major head injury that left him comatose for hours. He was hospitalized for 10 months and subsequently imprisoned until he could be repatriated to Germany after the war. The head injury left him with what was called a stammer, but to some of us one wonders whether it was an expressive aphasia, but he had that stammer for the rest of his life. Following World War I, he led an erratic life, started drinking heavily. Despite this, he returned to university and did very well. He got a PhD magna cum laude in food chemistry and went to work for I.G. Farben. He was fired from I.G. Farben because of his political activities and his drunkenness. He was a street brawler, a left-wing Nazi who worked for the common man. His view was that social distinctions should wither under the strong arm of the party, and that in the future everyone should be dressed alike in a simple blue uniform. He established the labor front to, in his words, end class struggle, restore social peace, and win over the workers to the Nazi ideals by looking after their social welfare and creating the right cultural atmosphere. His Strength Through Joy program offered cheap tickets to theater and opera, travel to foreign countries, recreational activities, all as part of a utopia for all classes, overseen by the Nazi Party. He lectured incessantly on behalf of the party. He said, "It was my fate. An inner voice drove me forward like hunted game, though my mind told me differently, and my wife and family repeatedly asked me to stop my activities and return to normal life. The voice ordered me, 'You must, you must,' and I obeyed the irresistible force." The Nazi Party gave him a sense of continuity in a chaotic world. Ley was fanatically loyal to Hitler and regarded the Nazi Party as our religious order, our home. Without it, we cannot live. Hitler was his Messiah. The Jew was his devil. War was a titanic, apocalyptic struggle between good and evil. To win that war, Germany must have a harmonious and united front and country. Independent actions, unions, slowdowns would interfere with that, and he made sure that they didn't occur. He supervised and participated in countless Nazi rallies. The Associated Press reported him as he was one of the more quotable Nazi leaders. He wrote on war, "War is a blessing of God. It's the expression of the highest and best in manhood." He wrote on America, "Hate, hate, hate. Every German must hate the gangsters, the murderers, the assassins who come from the center of world Jewry and capitalism, the United States of America. In this war, there can't be compromise with these half-breed Americans who come across the sea to slay in a war that does not concern them. He politicked at international labor conferences, praising National Socialism as a workers' paradise. But his foreign relations missions were not particularly successful. While attending one international meeting, he got more drunk than usual and alienated the entire Latin American delegation by saying that they looked like someone had lured them out of the jungle with bananas. He was dismissed by others in the party as a laughable bugaboo and eccentric idealist, but his goal was to have a reliable and loyal German workforce. He went everywhere speaking to the workers, and the German labor front grew to be enormous in size and money due to mandatory union dues on its 30 million members. In addition to his view about the nature of the state, he brought massive corruption and redeployed those dues for his personal uses. He always wanted to be somebody. He spent prodigiously to live like a prince. He had many villas, cars, private railroad cars as well. This is his living room. Despite living so extravagantly, he always remembered growing up in poverty and focused his efforts on trying to improve the morale of the underclass. He wrote, "There is nothing more degrading and humiliating for someone than when he recognizes that he is without value in human society." If workers cooperated, he would do everything possible to assure their comfort. He was their champion. He advocated for equal pay for women workers, for mandatory vacation time, and for hiring more workers rather than forcing workers to work overtime. He campaigned for better housing, health insurance for workers, humane working conditions, and strength through joy. To support the latter goal, he set up a travel agency for workers and provided very generous, inexpensive vacation benefits that were wildly popular. Indeed, 85% of German workers used this benefit to take cruises on the Rhine or on vacations on the North Sea. He even brought a cruise ship for the workers and modestly named it the Robert Ley. According to Ley, a happy worker would be a productive worker, and all of these extensive benefits would be provided under the watchful eye of the Gestapo. In 1935, Hitler decided to produce a people's car. He asked Ferdinand Porsche, the race car designer, shown here, to develop a prototype of the Volkswagen, and asked Ley and the German labor front, Ley is the third over, he asked them to finance the VW. Ley had a creative idea of financing this project, that the workers themselves should furnish the capital by an installment plan, 5 marks a week. Once 750 marks had been paid in, the buyer would receive an order number entitled him to a car once it was eventually produced. There was a huge advertising campaign to persuade the workers to put aside part of their wages to save up for the car, and the slogan was, "A car for everyone." This was a great success, and over 300,000 workers applied to buy a Volkswagen. On the flip side, and there was a flip side, Ley was not just a benign futurist, but a ferocious fighter for the party. If the workers didn't cooperate, if they went on strike or opposed the party, they were killed. He destroyed the independent labor unions, killed off the leaders, and built a labor force that was aligned with Nazi war plans. He also helped to organize slave labor to support the war effort. When the Allies eventually invaded Germany, Ley and Goebbels created the werewolf battalions to fight a guerrilla war in Germany against the Allies and to carry out sabotage and assassination, ultimately killing about 5,000 people. I'm trying to provide context. If you're going to make your own assessment of Robert Ley, you need to know where he came from, what he did, what in the complexity of his behavior. And we'll get into that a bit more shortly. Ley flew into frequent violent rages, and his drinking problems were legendary. In 1937, he drunkenly careened around Munich with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in tow. As one of his aides recounted, he drove the car through the locked gates and then raced up and down at full speed between the barracks, scaring hell out of the workers and nearly running several over. The next day, Hitler told Goering to take over the Duke's visit before Ley killed him. Other Nazi leaders were jealous of his expanding power and skeptical of the value of all these worker benefits. Goering, for instance, sniffed, the labor front should make more strength and less joy. In the early days of the party, Ley had been a beer hall hooligan, but he acquired an incredibly large portfolio of responsibility. His closeness to Hitler shielded him from charges alleging arrogance and incompetence. He was a dreamer with little follow-through and spotty organizational abilities, but his portfolio was immense and dedicated to the workers. He wrote, "I had the responsibility for peace of labor, production of the factories, and confidence of the worker in the system of National Socialism. I accomplished my task. Until May 1945, there was never a strike nor a report of sabotage. To the contrary, the armament production showed a steady rise, even amongst the foreign laborers. I cannot think of a better vote of confidence." He led a troubled personal life. He had a track record of embarrassing the party because of his public embezzlements and drunkenness. He constantly quarreled with other high party members in an effort to expand his empire. They in turn called him a vulgar drunkard and a mindless bullshitter. Throughout it all, he was impulsive and unpredictable. His first wife was Elizabeth Schmidt. After their divorce, he married a beautiful young soprano, Inga Spilker. He loved her so much that at one dinner party, he tore her clothes off so guests could admire her body. Inga had had enough. Between his behavior and her drug addiction, it was too much. She shot herself in December 1942. Ley's behavior deteriorated. He became even more erratic, and the staff worried about his violent temper and drinking. Himmler was so concerned that he asked his private physician to treat Ley for alcoholism. The physician gave up, noting to Himmler that after a month of daily house calls, he had not once found Ley sober. Ley bought a whole series of grand villas paid for by the labor front. He was indicted at Nuremberg for his labor practices and his anti-Semitic propaganda. He wrote, "Sure, the Jew is also a person, but the flea is also an animal, only not a very pleasant one. and since the flea is not a pleasant animal, we don't see it as our duty to watch over and protect it, to allow it to flourish, so that it can stick and pain and torture us. Rather, we must render it harmless, and so it is with the Jews. He then published a book titled The Pestilence of the World, and he wrote, "War is a battle between world views, and the side that has the strongest faith will be victorious. Life is a struggle. The Jew is a parasite. Jews have a superiority complex and bring ruin, destruction, downfall, and murder. This is their nature." It's Passover this week, finishing up, and so Ley was aware of Passover. This is Ley's spin on Passover. The Jewish grain speculator Joseph reduced the Egyptian people to starvation and misery through his speculation. When they realized that, they saw the Jewish depravity and freed themselves from Jewish rule by putting the Jews in concentration camps and forcing them to work. The Jews swore revenge, incited the lowest elements, and killed thousands of Egyptian children in one night. So he has a consistent worldview. He reframes everything in that worldview. He went on to talk about Bolshevism. Bolshevism, from Moses to Stalin, is the rule of the criminal, the mob, and the underworld. The Jew's weapon is money. His idol is gold. Rothschild was a filthy ghetto Jew from Frankfurt who spread a devilish financial system across Europe. It trapped the peoples and the emperors in their web, where it sucked them dry like a spider. If humanity wants to live, there is no other choice than to fight a pitiless battle against the Jews in every form. You know, when we look at politics today or any time, there's a tendency to think that things cohere together. But various aspects don't have to cohere together. And you can see in Robert Ley the left-wing side of National Socialism amplexed to the totalitarian, vicious racism. And it's good to keep that in mind. One of his illustrations in his book. As the war wound down, the Nazi leaders were corralled and tucked away out of view. Ground zero for their apprehension was the unlikely little village of Mondorf in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. The luxurious Palace Hotel had been in use since the mid-19th century as a spa resort, and by 1945 it was occupied by U.S. troops who constructed 15-foot-high barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and searchlights that ringed the perimeter of this four-star resort. At that point, the Palace Hotel had morphed into Central Continental Prisoner of War Enclosure number 32, codenamed Ashcan. Security was so tight there that getting in required a pass signed by God, and then somebody has to verify the signature. Ashcan wasn't exactly a jail. Technically, it was a prisoner of war camp, and within the confines of the camp, the prisoners were free to circulate. Thus, it was more like an elegant old university fraternity house, but with extras, guards carrying machine guns, and the ever-present wire fences and searchlights. On May 16, 1945, Ley was captured in his pajamas. He tried to poison himself upon capture, but the bottle was knocked out of his hands. And when he was searched, the troops found an additional cyanide capsule hidden in a ring. On arrival at Ashcan, he was allowed to change from his pajamas to khakis, but then he looked like a Bowery bum who had got into an induction center while on a toot. At Ashcan, few of the other leading Nazis would have anything to do with Ley. There had been too many struggles, too many turf wars, and his alcoholism and corruption were too much even for Goering. Ley's interrogations at Ashcan were difficult. When he was questioned, he would get carried away on the topic, shouting, stammering, and pacing the room. Throughout the interrogation, Ley argued that he could be useful to the Allies by organizing their working classes, just as he had done so effectively in Germany. In the months of their detention and interrogation at Ashcan, the detainees had plenty of time to pace the long veranda, to think and to gossip. Despite its somewhat Spartan furnishings, the prison resembled a retreat center. A famous photograph captures the detainees in a posed moment as the class of 1945. Ley bristled at being described as a war criminal and complained that it was illegal to apply international laws retroactively. I don't see how you can make a law after things have been done. Even God first made the 10 Commandments and then judged the people by them afterwards. He continued complaining of his imprisonment and wrote to psychiatrist Douglas Kelly, "I feel very unhappy because I have been robbed of my freedom." While awaiting trial in Nuremberg, he complained, "Stand us against a wall and shoot us. Well and good, you are victors. But why should I be brought before a tribunal like a," and he starts to stammer, "like a criminal? I can't even get the word out." Writing his lawyer, he continued in the same vein, "I understand that the victor thinks he has to exterminate and destroy his hated opponents. I'm not defending myself against being shot or killed. I'm defending myself against being branded as a criminal and against a procedure without any legal foundation, based on pure caprice. I am a German and a National Socialist, but I am no criminal." In his prison interrogations, Ley was surprisingly open and insightful when he talked about the Nazi defeat. He said, "I wish to say at this time that one thing broke us, not only externally, but within ourselves. We had the belief that the will of the human being was omnipotent and that we did not need the compassion of heaven. The defeat has taught us different." All of these various interrogations, you see him oscillating between defiance, acceptance, peculiar. If you're listening and wondering, is it the same person? I had that sense as well as I was diving into the archives. His interrogations revealed a curious melange of remorse, insight, and astonishing misjudgment. He reported that in his cell, he'd been talking about the war with his dead wife and thought that the Jews would pardon him if only he could talk with Chaim Weizmann. He wanted to form a committee of anti-Semites and Jews and proposed establishing a non-anti-Semitic Nazi party in the United States. Ley's interrogations were difficult because he was hard to understand because of his stammer, but he was so excitable and uninhibited. Ley would jump up off a chair, wave his arms, pace, and shout repeatedly during the interviews. The Nuremberg psychiatrist noted that Ley was totally unable to carry on a coherent conversation without starting a ranting speech. He would then stand up, pace the floor, throw out his arms, gesticulate more and more violently, and begin to shout. An interrogator at Nuremberg asked Ley about his accomplishments. Ley said, "We have destroyed the functions of the trade union, but at the same time we've added the following: strength through joy, leisure time, and recreation to a very large extent, generous health projects with plant physicians, and so forth, a program for increasing all efficiency with model plants, general recommendations to be followed in factories in which millions of workmen participated, housing projects on a vast scale, and a public education for the masses. I endeavored to make the fate of both the German workman as well as the workmen of foreign origin as pleasant and possible. I regret very much that this ideal organization will not be introduced in other countries for the benefit of their people. Ley was indicted in October 1945, and somehow it came as a shock to him. He had been in this compound since May, but it was a shock. He couldn't stand the imprisonment at Nuremberg. It brought back echoes of his father's disgrace. He didn't mind being treated as an enemy, but was humiliated to be considered a criminal. He would be dead in 2 weeks, and not at the hands of the tribunal. On October 25th, 1945, he rigged a noose from strips of towels, stuffed his mouth with his underpants, tied the other end of the towels to a sink pipe, sat down in the toilet, leaned forward, and strangled himself. The guard realized too late that Ley was not just sitting on the toilet seat. Ley left multiple suicide notes. In one, he went out of the way to say that he was not mistreated in prison. In another, he expressed remorse and guilt for his activities during the war. I can't stand the shame anymore. I have been one of the responsible men. I was with Hitler in the good days during the fulfillment of our plans and hopes, and I want to be with him in the black days. God led me whatever I did. We have forsaken God, and therefore we were forsaken by God. Anti-Semitism distorted our outlook, and we made grave errors. The other Nuremberg prisoners couldn't have cared less about Ley's suicide. They regarded him as a fantastic dreamer with his dreams as confused as his talks. One of them said his death should have occurred 15 years sooner. Shocked of the Reichsbank added he only regretted the delay of the incident. Goering was thoroughly disgusted, and Streicher was ashamed to be locked up with such a weakling. Chirac, the youth leader, thought Ley's death was cowardly unfair to the rest of them because Ley would no longer be able to help with their defense. When Robert Ley hanged himself in 1945, he had no way of knowing that he had fulfilled the wishes of many American medical societies that had written to Justice Jackson requesting the brains of the war criminals. Their letter, buried in the Library of Congress, says, "If and when the accused has been convicted and sentenced to death, it would be desirable to have a detailed autopsy, especially of the brain." Of all of the war criminals, it was only Ley who gratified their wish, and his brain was meticulously examined. The rest of the executed war criminals were cremated, taking the secrets of their brains with them. An old and established medical tradition links peculiar behavior to brain injury, bad brains, if you will. And it comes as no surprise that this neural explanation was a prominent sentiment at Nuremberg, particularly in the case of Robert Ley. In his instance, recall, there's a history of multiple severe head injuries, as well as autopsy findings, ostensibly demonstrating an abnormal brain. Let's go into what the psychiatric and psychologic testing revealed in prison. Psychiatrist Douglas Kelly knew Ley, worked with him beginning in Ashcan in May. He observed Ley daily for 6 weeks and wrote his summary of Ley to the commanding officer of Nuremberg just days before Ley killed himself. reading the notes could leap out of a psychiatric examination today, the same cadence, the same report of history, mental status exam. There's an odd sense of continuity with a colleague from 70 years ago. The psychiatrist wrote, normal psychomotor reactions and normal attitudes and behavior. Mood is normal, but affect is extremely labile. Ley is easily excited and demonstrates marked emotional instability. Content is normal, although euphoric trends are present. Sensorum is intact. Insight is good. Judgment is fair. He is one of the most potentially suicidal prisoners due to his extreme instability, secondary to his old head injury. Ley is competent. Ley hanged himself the next day. The psychiatrist noted the overall picture of Robert Ley's Rorschach record is definitely that of an individual suffering from damage to his frontal lobes. His inhibitory centers had ceased to function. The details of the Rorschach response are arresting. Ley would frequently get derailed. Here is the psychiatrist's verbatim description. In card 4, Ley saw a funny bear, fur spread out. And in the inquiry, he stated, you can see the head and teeth with terrific legs. It has shadows and peculiar arms. It's alive, and it represents Bolshevism overrunning Europe. Once he started on that track, there was a short intermission until we could get Dr. Ley off the subject of Bolshevism and back to the subject of the Rorschach cards. Kelly, the psychiatrist, was most of all struck by Ley's bad judgment and emotional instability, which he attributed to frontal lobe damage. For instance, Ley had grandiose dreams of immigrating to America to solve American labor difficulties. A month before he killed himself, Ley wrote, Sir Henry Ford, asking for a job, reasoning that since both he and Ford were in the automobile business and both were anti-Semites, they would be natural partners. Ley's death presented an opportunity to literally get one's hands on a Nazi leader's brain. At least that's the way the popular press described it. The brain was removed from Ley's body an hour after his suicide and was shipped off to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington. There, it was studied by the most prominent neuropathologist of the time, Webb Haymaker. I have Haymaker's notes. His penciled report noted some brain atrophy suggested by widened folds on the surface of the brain. He also noted thickened membranes surrounding the brain's surface, which could have resulted from a long ago head injury. Haymaker commented, we are dealing with a case of confirmed degenerative atrophy of the frontal lobes. The appearance is that of a long-standing degeneration or chronic encephalopathy, the etiology of which is unknown. In press interviews, Haymaker went on to say that the frontal lobes were the seat of our inhibitions, the real control center that keeps most people from committing acts of violence. It's this part that enables us to have sympathy with our fellow man. He reported that microscopic examination of Ley's brain revealed chronic encephalopathy of sufficient duration and degree to have impaired Dr. Ley's mental and emotional faculty and could well account for his alleged aberrations in conduct and feeling. When the news got out, the Sarasota Herald Tribune quoted the Surgeon General as saying that these changes were sufficient to account for the unusual behavior of Ley. Not to be outdone, Life magazine ran a story showing Webb Haymaker dissecting Ley's brain. The AP headline from the Washington Times Herald said, Ley's brain was warped. The Washington Post was more restrained. Nazi Ley's brain found diseased. Well, this is a photograph of Ley's left cerebral hemisphere. It does demonstrate some slight frontotemporal atrophy with widened folds. There's no evidence of a contusion, but there are some fibrotic and thickened meninges. In severe alcoholism with malnutrition, one typically finds altered mammillary bodies in the brain. Haymaker would certainly have looked for this, and one has to infer that there was no abnormality given his silence on the matter. And besides, Ley was very well nourished. He was not a skid row alcoholic. He ate very well, so the malnourishment is unlikely to have occurred. Psychiatrist Kelly felt that the Ley's frontal lobe damage probably resulted from the plane crash in World War I. But in addition, Ley had sustained a second head injury in an automobile accident in 1930, and this also led to an extended period of unconsciousness, and his stammer was worsened, and he also had continuing tinnitus ever since that. Kelly commented to overcome his stammer, Ley turned to liquor. He found that if he drank a lot, the impediment became less noticeable. The neuropathologist studying the observing bilateral frontal lobe changes disagreed with Kelly's assessment that the injury related to the plane crash. Instead, they figured that this was more diffuse and more attributable not to trauma, but to alcoholism. There's an important postscript to the study, which brings us to the University of California. It turns out that Haymaker asked a colleague for a second opinion on the neuropathology. And he wrote a pathologist at UCSF, the Langley Porter Institute, and the pathologist wrote back, "I'm not impressed with any definite pathology in this case, at least such as would lead one to suspect a clinical organic condition. These findings are difficult to evaluate because of post-mortem or fixation artifact, but if real, the changes are not too significant. The histologic picture is that of diffuse chronic encephalopathy of nonspecific type." I'm going into this at some length because we all hear about rivaling psychiatric testimony in courts. There are rivaling neuropathology testimonies. There are rivaling expert testimonies everywhere. But in this case, we at least have a slide. It's a non-remarkable slide that shows no evidence of syphilis, no microglial hyperplasia, no evidence of Alzheimer's disease. If there was malice here, it was not grossly discernible on the slide. With the opinion of the UC San Francisco expert in hand, Haymaker wrote psychiatrist Kelly, "I've gone over the case very carefully and found changes, but they were of lesser scope than we had at first believed. Personally, I think we'd better let the whole thing lie buried, as the degree of change could be subject to a difference of opinion." As is typical with press reports about medical observations, there was no effort to correct the historical record. As far as readers of the Associated Press were concerned, Robert Ley's behavior was definitively traced to his bad brain. Bad brain or not, Robert Ley wasn't a monster in the Frankenstein sense. Indeed, he was one of the few Nuremberg defendants to have expressed any remorse over his action. So of all of the war criminals, Ley would certainly have been evaluated differently in the 21st century. After all, his neuropsychiatric presentation posed many questions. He suffered 2 major head injuries for the rest of his life. He was described as having a profound stammer, but one wonders in retrospect if this, as I mentioned, was an expressive aphasia. The accidents left him with impulsivity, and erratic behavior, no doubt aggravated by his legendary alcoholism. Today, if a Robert Ley had survived the attempted suicide and he was brought to trial, today the court would be very interested in documenting the degree of his impulsivity and mapping its extent with psychologic testing. But we wouldn't stop there, because memory and judgment would also have to be assessed. Most assuredly, we would obtain neural imaging to map the extent of the brain injury, and these evaluations would be absolutely routine. If we had a brain biopsy, we would perform newer staining techniques of more refinement. Had Ley come to trial today, all of these assessments would be presented in evidence, and the court would have to weigh their relevance. So imagine that we have Robert Ley in front of us, that he survived his suicide attempt. As a result, we wouldn't have his brain in front of him, but we would have his MRI and reports suggesting some degree of brain atrophy. Would you find Ley guilty should his medical history mitigate his sentence? With that, I suggest we pause and come back and discuss that.